And this will be the last one in our series, A Tale of Two People. And today's passage is 2 Samuel chapter 24, verses 1 to 25. Go and take a census of the people is the title. And I'm going to read from verses 1 and 2 only, even though we're looking at the entire chapter today. And instead of reading from my Bible, I'm going to read from the screen today because we're actually using the New Living Translation. So if you don't have the New Living Translation, I do just encourage you to have a look at the screen as we read the Word of God. The anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and he caused David to harm them by taking a census. Go and count the people of Israel and Judah, the Lord told him. So the king said to Joab and the commanders of the army, take a census of all the tribes of Israel, from Dan in the north to Beersheba in the south, so I may know how many people there are. Amen. Chapter 24 of 2 Samuel, which is the final chapter of this book, 1st and 2nd Samuel, is about David's census. The census that he takes, and this census leads to God's judgment on the nation of Israel. But reading this chapter, right from verse 1, we run into a theological conundrum because verse 1 seems to say that God caused David to take a census, and he got punished and judged for that. So there's a bit of a theological problem that we want to touch on briefly. And what adds to the problem is that this same event is recorded in 1 Chronicles, and in that book, and in that chapter, in 1 Chronicles chapter 21, there, it actually says that Satan rose up against Israel and caused David to take a census. So here in Samuel, it's God who caused, it seems like. And then in Chronicles, it's actually Satan that caused. How do we resolve this issue? I think it's, if you could, I don't want to go too deeply into this, but seeing this one issue from different angles, if you will. Because according to the Old Testament, basically, nothing happens outside God's control, right? So Samuel is kind of, coming from that perspective. Yes, at the end of the day, if God didn't allow it, then this would not happen. So it's from that perspective. But within that big, God's control, if you will, within that, God allowed it. And as Satan tempted David, David is the one that gave into the temptation and took the census. So I know this doesn't solve everything, but some of you may just find that a little bit odd. So I just want to touch on that before I go on. But more important thing I think here is to not ask that question, but actually try to see here what comes before what it says there in verse 1. So if you actually go back to verse 1 again, anger of the Lord burned against Israel. So in other words, Israel had become they're in a state where God is already angry with them. We don't know exactly why, but they've probably turned away from Him, turned against Him, or have done something that caused God to be angry towards them, and they deserve to receive God's wrath. And that's the more important thing. And it's the people that were in that situation. And because people were in that situation, it actually affected David, their king, as well. In other words, in every community, the leader has influence on the people that follow the leader, right? But that influence goes the other way too. The people influence the leader as well. Same thing with worship service as well. We think that it's only the person that's in front of the church and leading the worship, whether it's me or the praise team, that influences the congregation. But it's actually the congregation, the people, make the worship service together with the worship leader and the worship team. So influence goes both ways. And here, I kind of read it as well. The people have become so sinful and they deserve God's wrath. And that affected David too. And this temptation was provided to David as well. Because people as a whole, including David, their king, had become corrupt, sinful before God. So David orders this census to be taken, and Joab, David's general, seemed to know that this was something that David shouldn't have done. So in verse 3, he says, "May the Lord your God let you live to see 100 times as many people as there are now, O king. But why, my lord the king, do you want to do this?" In other words, I hope that God makes you big, David, King David. But Why are you trying to take this census? Don't do this, basically. That's what he's saying. But David doesn't budge. Verse 4, the king insisted that they take the census. So Joab and the commanders of the army went out to count the people of Israel. And it takes about 10 months for them to actually do the census. Verse 8, they do it for 9 months and 20 days. And what's the result of the census? Verse 9, Joab reported the number of people to the king. There were 800,000 capable warriors in Israel who could handle a sword, and 500,000 in Judah. So David orders this census to be taken, and the result that they get is, among all the other tribes of Israel, you have 800,000 soldiers that you have. And then among the tribe of Judah, you have 500,000 men capable of going out to war to fight. Great. This is a reason to celebrate, isn't it? Wow, God grew our nation so we have 800,000 capable warriors in our nation. Let's celebrate. Not so fast. God actually brings judgment on Israel for David taking this census. So here we can't not help but ask the question, what's the problem? What was it so wrong about taking the census that God got so angry and judged the people of Israel? Because God, in Numbers, the book of Numbers, actually tells and orders Moses to take the census 2 times. Numbers chapter 1, Numbers 26. God says, Moses, take the census of the people and come and find out how many people are able to go and fight the war. What's the difference? Well, the difference is, in the book of Numbers, there was a purpose of God. And that's what God ordered them to do. But here in the book of Samuel, there was no real purpose for David taking the census. And it's not because of God's command that David does this, but David is the one that orders Joab, his general, to go and take the census. And not only that, the census without any real purpose becomes a burden for the people of God, because as the Word of God says in the law, that when you actually take the census, you have to levy tax on every single person. So Exodus chapter 30, verse 11, whenever you take a census of the people of Israel, each man who is counted must pay a ransom for himself to the Lord. So there's a tax whenever there's a census that is taken in the Bible. So for David to take the census without any real purpose for doing so, is just going to levy tax that's unnecessary on the people of God. Now, you may think that small piece of silver may not be much, so hey, what's the big deal? Each person pays. Well, yes, but if you actually gather them all up, it's a lot of money. And if there wasn't any really purpose for taking this census, this money, I would say, could become a source of temptation and corruption for whoever has their hands on that money. Maybe temple leaders, right? Priests or whoever's running the temple. Maybe even King David. Because the nation had become 800,000 and 500,000. Add them together. These are how many soldiers you have. And that's how big the nation had come. But what kind of thoughts do you think would have passed in David's mind as he ordered this census to be taken? What were his feelings, maybe, perhaps, after he heard how many warriors and soldiers there were? He was probably thinking, good, just as I thought. Yes, indeed, we have grown. Look, 800,000 capable warriors in Israel and 500,000 capable soldiers in Judah. Good, just as I had thought. And he's counting. But when we compare this David from the David that was running away from Saul in the wilderness, in that place, David was not a person who cared about the numbers. I told you that David had a chance to kill Saul, who was trying to come after him twice. And in both times, David actually doesn't kill Saul, but let him go. But when we actually go to that account where David is running away from Saul in the wilderness, this is what it says. 1 Samuel chapter 22. There he says, he's in the wilderness, right? And then it says that he's there with 400 men. But these are 400 men that are not capable. But these are 400 men who are just vagabonds that happen to gather around David. So yes, it would have been good to have 400 with them still. But I'm also thinking David is responsible for taking care of these 400 people. He has to feed them. So it's not just good that he has 400 people, but these are 400 people who are homeless that he's leading and taking care of. And there, Saul chases him. But if you go to 1 Samuel 24, first time when Saul chases David, it says that verse 2, Saul came with 3,000 elite troops to go after David. Second time he comes, verse 26, chapter 26, verse 1 and 2. Verse 2, Saul took 3,000 of Israel, elite troops. So here's David, and Saul's here to catch David, and David has the chance to kill Saul, but he doesn't do it. But had he done that, in a moment, he could have just gotten rid of 3,000. Because if their king is killed, these 3,000 would have just fled. They wouldn't have come after David. Not only that, had David killed Saul, what could have possibly happened was that these 3,000 become David's men. And who's to say 3,000 will just be 3,000? Maybe it'll become 30,000 as he takes over the empire or the nation. And maybe 30,000 will become 300,000 for David. So David had a chance to go after the number here and this power, but he doesn't. He doesn't kill Saul, even though he had a chance to do it twice. Instead, this is what he says. 1 Samuel chapter 24. May the Lord judge between us. Perhaps the Lord will punish you for what you are trying to do to me, but I will not harm you. Second time, he also says similar thing. Chapter 26, verse 10, 1 Samuel. Surely the Lord will strike Saul down someday, or he will die of old age or in battle. In other words, I'm not going to kill Saul. I'm not going to rely on myself or this number, but I'm going to rely on the Lord. David was one that never cared about the numbers. Didn't matter if there were 3,000 that were after him. He didn't choose 3,000. He chose the one, this one God. And I'll rely on him. And I'll not go after this 3,000. 3,000 will not scare me because this one God that I rely on, he's the powerful one. David becomes king. And he fights the Philistines. And when you go to 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 17, it says that Philistines arrived, verse 18, and spread out across the valley of Rephaim. So they're here to fight you, and they're filled with Philistines in this valley. And yet David doesn't look at the number of the Philistines. Whoa, there are so many Philistines there trying to fight us. Oh man, this is not... He doesn't do that. What does he do? Verse 19. David asked the Lord, should I go out to fight the Philistines? He doesn't ask, how many Philistines are there in the valley? He asks, what does the Lord say about this? Does the Lord say I should go fight? Or does the Lord say I should not fight? That's what matters, not how many people are there in the valley, how many Philistine soldiers there are. You see, this David, in the very last chapter of 2 Samuel, where he's counting the soldiers he has in his nation, this David was never one that relied on numbers. He never chose what to do based on the numbers. He never relied on the numbers, but he relied on God. But over the years, something had changed. And now, he wants to count. When it was just 400 men in the wilderness with bunch of vagabonds, when he was running and relying on God, he didn't care about the number. But now that he's gotten big and he's become king, he wants to count and see how many soldiers he's got in his nation. Friends, something about the big numbers that's, in a weird way, very attractive to us, isn't it? And David's heart's motivation is exposed. And he relents and he repents. But when you look at this event, it's quite interesting because, I said in Numbers, God tells Moses to count the people too. But there, it actually says Moses did this just as the Lord had commanded Moses. But here, what it says is David says, well, you go take the census so I may know how many people there are. There's a difference, you see. Here, for David, the people had become his. It's my people, my nation. Tell me how many people there are so that I may know. Whereas in the book of Numbers, God told Moses, Moses did what God told him to do, and that's why he took the census. So here I get to our application for today. Friend, what's the number that you are counting right now? Is that number maybe perhaps you didn't count before, but you started counting, and it's affecting you? I've been a Sunday school teacher for how many number of years, so I know what it's like. I've been in worship services so many times that I know what's good and what's not. What's the number that you are counting right now? What's the number that you are relying on right now? Don't rely on that number. Rely on the Lord. And know that whatever number that you are counting right now may actually become a source of temptation. It may become a source of a temptation that will lead you down the wrong path, maybe down the path of pride, maybe down the path of not experiencing God in a more intimate way, because you are looking at that number you have achieved, and you're looking at it and go, hey, this is my number. Hey, this big number, that's me. I wrestled with this passage before the Lord, and I kept asking the Lord, Lord, what is the number that I'm counting nowadays? And then what God revealed to me in my heart was I started counting the number of years I've been a pastor. I've been a pastor for more than 20 years. I've been a church plant pastor for 6 years, going on the 7th year. And I've been counting this number, and I've been using this number to use that number to think that I've done something important and valuable, great, and now that I know because I've been doing this for 20 years, anybody wants to plant a church, come to me. There isn't a single place that I have knocked door on. I've been everywhere. I've done everything. And in the process, I was starting to lose that heart when I didn't have the numbers. Heart that David had in the wilderness, where he totally relied on God, not on my numbers that I have achieved. What is that number that you are relying on? Don't rely on that number. My age, I've lived how many years now, and I know what life is all about. I've been doing this for how many years? So I know. And you've lost that purity. You've lost that joy. You've lost that good innocence, spiritual innocence and purity that you had. Because your number's gotten bigger. Whatever that number in your life is. I have this in my computer, a file with a password on, which I call the X file. And I put a lot of stuff in there so no one can get to it. But, this X file is not a negative thing. It's actually a good thing because, in Greek, Jesus Christ is actually Christos. And the first letter is X. So for me, my X file is file in which I record all the things that God's been doing, amazing things. And I record it by year, the year that we began One Hope. And for that year, I put in my X file these things that are just so amazingly timely that you can't say that was coincident kind of things, testimonies, right? And as I've been thinking about this number that I've been relying on, God kind of brought that file to me and He said, well, Daniel, what about in 2024? Do you have anything recorded in your file in 2024? Or have you lost that spirit of wilderness? Maybe you've lost it too. When you first became a Christian, when you first met Jesus, you didn't think about the numbers. All you thought about was God and you relied on Him. Even from the little things to the big things. And you've had testimony after testimony of God just amazingly timing things for you and doing things that you never thought He would do. And then it was so amazing. And over the years, all those things have started to disappear. And all you've got is just numbers. And try to find security in that. You try to find your identity in that. But maybe you're not like David. When you count up the things in your life and what you have done, maybe for some of you it's like, well, I wish my number was big, but my number is so small. It actually discourages me, disappoints me to see that my number is so small. Well, if that's you, here's your chance to experience the wilderness spirituality, where God does things in amazing ways, so timely. I look at my X file and, there are these moments where, God, this is impossible that this is humanly orchestrated. It has to be you, how timing was so perfectly, how you opened this door, that door, that door. You can experience that if you're in that place where you look at your number, whatever that is. My number is so small. Well, here's your chance to rely on God and experience His power, His leading in your life. And perhaps you can start building up your own X file. Do you have an X file? If not, start creating one. Year by year. Start recording things that this can't be a coincidence, but only God must have been the one who did this. I think as we think about, because we are going into our 7th year next year, and maybe God is just trying to get me to just prepare for next year already, but just sense I get is we got to get back to that spirit. We got to get back to that spirit where, number didn't mean anything to us. And we were just here with that sense of wilderness spirituality. And we're just like, hey, God is doing something. Hey, I would gladly just walk around everywhere. I'll drive around everywhere gladly without complaints. And I'll just knock on door because this week we must worship. We got to gather as God's people. And I need a place. We need a place, God. That kind of wilderness spirituality. Maybe that's where God is calling us to go back to. So here's our takeaway for today. So friends, be careful of the lure of the numbers. Don't get deceived by the numbers. If it's big, don't get deceived. Even if it's small, don't get disappointed. Don't get deceived, don't get disappointed. Don't base your identity and who you are and your value based on the number. Don't base it on the number of your grade percentage. Don't base your identity on the number of how much balance you've got, how many accomplishments you have accomplished. Be careful of the deception of the numbers. Don't be deceived, but also don't be disappointed. Just as the song that we're going to sing today says, let's just do this together. That eyes that you have fixed on that number, whatever number is, let's just take our eyes away from that number that you are fixated on, and let's get fixated on God. As the song says, God, I look to you. I won't look to that number. I will look to you. Give me vision to see things like you. Number whatever that number is in my life. And to see it like the world does. But let me see it as you see it. I will look to you. And I'll ask you to help me. And help me to experience amazing work of God in my life. What's your problem today? What's the problem you're dealing with? Some of you must have it. We all have it, don't we? How are you going to deal with it? Let's not keep looking at the numbers, statistic, and let's just try relying on God and see what He does. So that your X file, your Christ file will continue to grow. Felt like God was keep saying to me, go back to the beginning days, go back. I'm like, no, God, I don't want to go back. I don't want to jump from one coffee shop to another coffee shop to keep okay, close, I got to go there. Oh, I feel like the person at the coffee shop is looking at me. I've been here for 2 hours and I should maybe go to another coffee shop. I don't want to go back to that place. I want to sit in my office and prepare my sermon. God, why are you telling me to go back to that beginning days? But I was mishearing Him. I think what He was saying is, not your situation, but your spirit. The spirit that you had when you first began. Jumping from one coffee shop to another coffee shop, you were still joyful. Knocking on every door in the neighborhood, asking if there's a possibility of using the church for Sunday worship. You weren't embarrassed. You were happy. You were anticipating maybe God will do something and experiencing that spirit. Go back to that place. I think that's what He was saying. So I'm like, okay, good, thank you. Because I don't want to give up my office right now. I don't want to give it up. But spirit, yes, I'll go back to that place. I think we're on the verge of either losing that spirit and just becoming a church that just does things as all the others do. Here we need to just grab hold of ourselves again and then go back to that spirit of wilderness again together. Those of you who were there from the beginning, remember those days, right? And those of you who joined us later, you need to see that this is what we're about. We're about a wilderness community. We are a tabernacle community. Not temple community, tabernacle that continues to move. That's our spirit. That's our spirit. So whatever number is deceiving you, let's lay it down. Whatever number that's disappointing you, let's look to God and rely on Him. I'm going to invite the praise team to come back up, and we're going to sing this song and declare that together. God, I look to you. I won't look to this number, but I'll look to you. And I'll rely on you. And I'll ask you, God, to do your work. And help me to experience your amazing work in my life. How disappointing would it be to call ourselves Christian and all our lives we never even experienced one little miracle. One little, this has got to be too good to be coincident moment. How can we go our Christian life without not even experiencing that once in our lives, right? At least once. We gotta experience it. You can experience it more than once. Not all the time. I don't want to give you false hope. But it's not just once or twice. We are to experience that if we will let Him lead us. So let's sing it together. Would you stand with me?